You might have seen this going around Twitter. This was making the rounds yesterday from Rolling Stone. Rolling Stone put out an article that said, "How should France rebuild Notre Dame? Much of the structure survived the blaze, but as rebuilding efforts move forward, the country will be left with a big question. What does the cathedral mean to 21st century France?" This is the question. What are we rebuilding? What country is rebuilding it? What is France? When Notre Dame was built 800 years ago, France was entirely animated by Christianity, by the church. 8 centuries later, things have changed dramatically. What would it be? Rolling Stone wants to make sure that you don't miss the point that they're making. They put it in really gross terms. Quote, "But for some people in France, Notre Dame has always served as a deep-seated symbol of resentment, a monument to a deeply flawed institution, and an idealized Christian European France that arguably never existed in the first place. The building was so overburdened with meaning that its burning feels like an act of liberation," says Patricio Del Real, an architecture historian at Harvard University. Wow. First of all, leave it to the American universities, leave it to Harvard. This is the kind of person who is teaching your children. The building was so overburdened with meaning that its burning feels like an act of liberation. Imagine for just a second if the Al-Haram Mosque in Mecca burned down, or half of it burned down, or the roof collapsed. Imagine that. And then imagine Rolling Stone writing and saying, you know, for many people, the burning down of that mosque, which was so overburdened with meaning, felt like an act of liberation. I don't think they would say that, would they? What does it even mean to be overburdened with meaning? Actually, it does have a meaning. It has a meaning in the long history of Western thought. The meaning here is the central theme of Western modernity, which is liberation or emancipation or whatever you want to call it. Call it liberation. I mean, this is the major theme of the West. This is the dominant theme of liberalism. Capital L liberalism. Classical liberalism, left-wing liberalism, liberalism itself. We sometimes forget, because liberals hate freedom so much, it seems, in this modern time, that liberalism is about freeing yourself. It's about liberation. Many times you'll hear conservative critics say, liberalism contains the seeds of its own destruction. So this kind of crazy, decadent, suicidal culture that we're living in now is the inevitable result of the ideas of liberalism. When people talk about that, this is what they're talking about. This is what happens at the radical extreme of liberation, because it begins, especially in the modern era, with liberation, first from institutions, then from the ideas themselves. So it always begins with the institutions, and you say, well, I don't want to just be tied to some silly, deeply flawed institution. So I'm going to divorce myself from the institution, then I'm going to be able to live in this pure realm of ideas. But it doesn't really work out that way. What happens is you divorce yourself from the institution, then you divorce yourself from the ideas. You see this most obviously in the church. So this is a process that now has gone on in our civilization for 1,000 years, certainly since the Protestant Revolution. You see a divorce from the church, then a divorce from religion itself. So even today, plenty of people who grow up in going to their local church with their families, grow up every week, maybe they go to Bible study or something. What you see on the trend lines is those people who then leave the church. They'll say, well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Because the church, whatever church you belong to, the Baptist church, the Methodist church, the Anglican church, Catholic church, whatever church you belong to, you can always say it's a deeply flawed institution. Obviously, the Catholic Church is a deeply flawed institution. Hilaire Belloc, one of the most famous Catholic writers ever, said that the proof of the divinity of the Catholic Church is the fact that it still exists, because any merely human institution that was conducted with such knavish imbecility would certainly not have survived a fortnight. Obviously, you can point to all of these other religious institutions as well. You can point to the problems in the Methodist Church or the Baptist Church or the Evangelical Church or whatever. So you say, okay, I want to leave this deeply flawed institution, and that way I'll have a purer sense of religion. I've liberated myself, so now I'm just in the realm of ideas. But spiritual but not religious, or religious but not organized religious, or eventually you just divorce yourself from the ideas as well. Think about what's happened to national institutions. First you liberate yourself from national institutions, civic institutions, then you divorce yourself from the nation itself. We've seen our commitment to religious institutions decline dramatically over the past 40 years. What happened? Trailed it by about 10 or 20 years. People's declining in religiosity itself. As people pull away from the Boy Scouts and the Lions Club and other civic institutions, what have we seen trailing it by a couple decades is less of an identity with the nation itself. How about familial institutions? As we liberate ourselves from the institutions of the family, what happens? We isolate ourselves from family ties themselves. We have a society that has never been more lonely, never been more isolated. This happens. This is what Edmund Burke, the founder of modern conservative thought, this is what he saw as a perverse liberation. In one of his most famous excerpts from Reflections on the Revolution in France, he wrote, "The age of chivalry is gone, that of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever. Never, never more shall we behold the generous loyalty to rank and sex, that proud submission, that dignified obedience, that subordination of the heart, which kept alive, even in servitude itself, the spirit of an exalted freedom, the unbought grace of life, the cheap defense of nations, the nurse of manly sentiment, and heroic enterprise is gone." This is a very hard statement for a modern Western person to hear. For a classical liberal or a modern liberal or a leftist liberal or whatever, to hear that dignified obedience, that proud submission, that subordination of the heart which kept alive even in servitude itself, an exalted freedom. What Burke is addressing here is that you can't just liberate yourself forever. You can't just keep liberating and liberating and liberating. Ultimately, you'll liberate yourself from all meaning. You'll liberate yourself from everything that matters. You'll liberate yourself from yourself. There is this shallow liberty, this shallow freedom, and then there is an exalted freedom which actually requires some subservience. It actually requires some obedience. We're in Holy Week now, and Christ, who comes to free people from sin, free us from our own damnation. How does he come? Does he come as a guy who's totally liberated, who's walking around like a modern 20th century liberated hippie guy? No. He comes as a servant. He is serving. He is submitting to the will of his Father. He's serving others.